Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Before I get started, I would like to thank the organizing committee of this workshop, particularly Pablo, not only for your effort to putting all this together, but also for your kindness of inviting me to be part of this. I am delighted to be here with you today. And also I like to thank Juan Villalba and Deborah Temple for their help in putting this presentation together. Now, I like to divide this presentation into three parts. First, I like to give you a very short background on the concept of animal welfare. Then I like to discuss very briefly the welfare problems that can be found in extensive production systems. And finally, I like to discuss the benefits that extensive production systems have from an animal welfare standpoint, which I think are clearly greater than the problems that they may cause. Okay, so I think we all probably agree that animal welfare has become a fundamental part of livestock production nowadays, almost everywhere. And although we do have many definitions of animal welfare, the consensus is that basically animal welfare is a measure of how well an animal copes with its environment. And this coping process includes physical aspects and mental or affective aspects as well. So animal welfare goes beyond physical health, understood as the absence of disease and injury, because it includes as well the behavior and the affective state of the animals. Now, welfare is an attribute of the individual animal, and now we have tools to assess welfare objectively, independently of ethical or moral considerations. Now, having said this, however, I think that it is clear that basically our concern about animal welfare is grounded on ethical grounds and is a consequence of the fact that animals are sentient beings. But beyond this moral aspect, which again, I think it is fundamentally important, but beyond this moral aspect, we know now that the welfare of farm animals is closely linked to the welfare and health of human beings in many different ways. So, for example, we know that as we improve the welfare of farm animals, we reduce the likelihood of some zoonotic diseases being more prevalent in the herd or in the flock of animals. This is a very nice paper done in Sweden showing that when we compare flocks of broiler chickens, as the welfare status of the animals is improved, the likelihood or the prevalence of Campylobacter, which, as you know, is a main zoonotic disease, goes down. So basically, animal welfare is important. We have a good working definition of animal welfare, and we know it is important not only for moral reasons, but also because it is closely linked to human welfare and human health. Now, probably many of you are familiar with this concept, the 5 freedoms, which for many years has been the working definition of animal welfare. Now, a few years ago, this framework has been criticized on different grounds, one of them being that it emphasizes the absence of the negative and basically forgets the presence of positive affective states. So the scientific community working on animal welfare basically thinks now that this approach, the 5 freedoms, is outdated and has been replaced by a slightly different approach, which is the 5 domain approach, which was put forward by David Mellor and Wright in 1994, and has been reviewed several times, last review in 2020. And this model basically starts by considering domains 1 to 4, nutrition, environment, health, and behavior. And the idea is that from each of these domains, several positive and negative experiences may arise. And all these experiences that come from these 4 domains converge into the 5th domain, which is the mental state of the animal, basically the balance between positive and negative mental experiences. And it is this overall balance of negative and positive mental experiences what defines the welfare state of an individual. And I will be using this framework of the 5 domains proposed by Mellor to several times in my talk. So basically, remember animal welfare, coping success, the 4 domains, nutrition, environment, health, and behavior, which converge into the 5th domain, which defines what we understand as the welfare of the animal, the balance between positive and negative mental experiences. And remember as well that we are talking about something which is important, not only for the animal's sake, but also for the sake of human health and welfare. Now, interestingly enough, the concept of animal welfare has been linked very often to intensive production systems. And this is due to a great extent to historical reasons. Back in the 1960s, last century, this book, Animal Machines, was published, and this basically is looked at as the formal starting point of animal welfare research. And in this book, the intensive systems were criticized as imposing several restrictions on the natural behavior and hence on the welfare of the animals. So from this, very often, people have thought and suggested that animal welfare problems pertain only to intensive systems and not to extensive systems. This leads me to the second part of my talk, where basically I would like to convey the idea that this is not true by any means. So it is true that animal welfare can be very good in extensive systems. It is also true that extensive systems have many advantages from an animal welfare standpoint, but it is not true that animal welfare is always satisfactory in extensive systems. Extensive systems may have, and very often have, very serious welfare problems. And Deborah Temple and myself put together this review in Frontiers, looking at the main welfare problems in extensive systems. You can have a look at it if you wish, but basically in this slide you have a summary of the main welfare problems that animals may encounter in extensive systems. And many of them are really common sense. We don't have such a strict control over food and water supply in extensive systems as we have in intensive ones, and depending on the geography and time of year, animals may suffer from lack of food and water. Animals may encounter very difficult climatic conditions. Some diseases are more prevalent in intensive systems, but the opposite is also true for some diseases which are more prevalent in extensive systems, such as some parasitic diseases, for example. Clearly, health is a fundamental part of animal welfare, and an important requisite to guarantee the health of the animals is to be able to supervise the animals often, and supervision may be more difficult in extensive systems than in intensive ones. And finally, we have two welfare problems which may cause a lot of suffering in animals and that tend to be much more prevalent and more intense in extensive systems. And these are predation and neonatal mortality due to starvation, exposure, and predation again. So in this very brief second part of my talk, basically the idea I would like to convey is that even though historically we have thought of animal welfare problems as being typical of intensive systems, this is not entirely true because we may have extensive systems which are clearly poor in terms of animal welfare. So the fact that animals are in extensive conditions is not by itself a guarantee of good welfare. Having said this, however, what I would like to argue during the rest of my talk is that despite these problems, extensive systems offer many good things, many advantages in terms of animal welfare. And I like to argue as well that these advantages in terms of animal welfare can be classified into two broad categories. We have specific advantages, and then we have some more general, subtle benefits of extensive systems that have been overlooked very often, but that to me are as important or even more important than these better known effects which are more specific. But let's start with these more specific advantages. Clearly, the one that has received more attention is the fact that animals are more able to express their natural behavior in extensive systems than in intensive systems. And we know that the ability to express some behaviors is an important requisite for welfare. In animal behavioral sciences, we call these important behaviors, we call them behavioral needs. And in this table from a paper by Brack and Hofstad, we have a list of behavioral needs or important behaviors for farm animals. And as you can see, many of them are related to feeding. Feeding behavior, looking for food is a behavioral need. I will go back to this concept later on. And obviously, animals are more able to express the natural behavior in extensive systems than in intensive ones. And this is clearly a specific advantage. And the inability of animals to express this natural behavior may have very apparent consequences. These are a couple of slides taken on two sheep farms in Spain and showing this problem we call bull plucking. Bull plucking means that some ewes pluck the bull of other animals. This may cause injury to the animals that suffer the problem, but also shows that the animals performing the behavior are not in a good welfare state. That's what we call behavioral restriction. And we have seen that the likelihood of bull plucking increases as the time out of pasture gets longer. So if sheep stay a couple of weeks out of pasture, the behavior is very unlikely. But if they stay more than 1 or 2 months, then the behavior becomes very widespread. So it's a very clear demonstration of how important it is for animals to be able to show their natural behavior. And this is more likely in extensive systems. The advantages, these specific advantages of extensive systems go beyond behavior. This is a picture of a silvopastoral system in Latin America. This has been very much researched in Colombia and Mexico particularly. And our colleagues there have shown that cattle in these silvopastoral extensive systems are not only able to perform the natural behavior, but also they tend to be in better body condition, they tend to be healthier, and interestingly enough, and we don't have a convincing explanation for that effect, they are less afraid of human beings than animals in other systems, in more intensive systems. So far, the specific advantages of extensive production systems. But what I would like to argue now is that these extensive systems provide some more subtle overarching advantages in terms of animal welfare. And this links very well with what Juan just explained in his talk a few minutes ago. Now, my suggestion is that extensive systems or can be very good for animal welfare because they provide diversity and the ability to choose, and also because they provide challenges for the animals. Let's start with diversity and choice. And again, I would like to suggest that diversity can have specific advantages. For example, diversity of food. This table comes from a paper by Mellor. Remember the 5 domains. And one of the positive effects that can be derived from the domain feeding is eating a variety of foods. And this is not only a hedonic effect, as one was suggesting, but also the fact that individual animals differ in the specific requirements. And by providing diversity, we are able to cater for this diversity, for this individual variability in requirements. So this is a specific advantage of diversity and choice in the area of feeding. We have a similar positive effect of diversity in the area of environment. And it has been shown, for example, that comfort temperature may vary across individuals of a given species due to levels of activity, a stage of reproductive cycle, and even temperament and personality of the animals. Again, if we provide diversity of environments, the ability of animals to choose, we cater for these individual differences in climatic requirements. So we have specific advantages of offering diversity and choice to animals. But to me, the most interesting thing is that diversity and choice may prevent an important negative affective mental state. Remember, again, the Mellor approach, the 5 domains, what determines the welfare status of an animal is its mental state. So positive affective states balanced against negative affective states. A few years ago, scientists were skeptical as to whether animals can experience boredom. But now most scientists in the field of animal welfare accept that boredom is a negative affective state encountered in many mammals and birds that causes suffering in animals, and clearly offering the animals the ability to choose a diversity of stimuli is a way to reduce the likelihood of boredom. And the other thing which is good in extensive systems is that they go well beyond providing diversity and choice. They provide challenges. They make animals work and even sometimes have to experience some levels of moderate stress. So the question is this good? So are challenges good for animal welfare? And the answer is yes. We have an increasing body of evidence showing that challenges can be good for the welfare of the animals. And these are 2 examples of this. One is what we call the Eureka effect, meaning that when humans or non-human animals are able to solve a problem, to solve a challenge, they experience a positive affective state. This was shown back in the 1950s in primates, and more recently has been shown in cattle, goats, and other farm animals. So giving the animals the opportunity to overcome a challenge, to solve a problem, causes this positive affective state. And something very relevant in the context of this talk, which has this conference where feeding and nutrition is very important, something very, very relevant is this phenomenon of contra-free loading. Meaning that in many animals, when we give them a choice, they are able to choose between eating food which is readily available and doesn't require any effort, or they can work to get food. Most animals choose this second option. So basically, animals like the challenge to have to work to get food rather than getting the food easily available without having to do anything to get it. That is what we call contra-free loading in behavioral sciences. And basically, it means that having this challenge of looking for food, selecting food, spending time foraging is something that provides positive mental experiences to the animals. Of course, for challenges to be good from an animal welfare perspective, they have to match the animal's skills. And this is a graph that I think depicts this very, very clearly. If the skills of the animals are much more developed than the difficulty of the challenge is, then animals may experience boredom, as I was explaining before. The opposite is also true. If the challenges are excessive compared to the skills of the animals, animals may experience negative stress and fear. So the secret here is to match the intensity of the challenges to the skills of the animals to stimulate exploration, play, agency, and competence, which all lead to positive affective states. So it's a matter of balance between skills and intensity of challenges. And this importance of the skills of the animals leads me to the last idea of my talk, which is the importance of temperament or personality when we look at the welfare of the animals. But before that, almost forgetting, a final idea about the benefits of extensive systems from an animal welfare standpoint. Besides these immediate positive effects that I have reviewed, we think now that challenges and diversity may have long-term benefits for animal welfare. And to understand this, we have to remember that there is a structure in the brain of the animals, which is the hippocampus, which is very important to control stress. So a healthy, well-functioning hippocampus is important for animals to be able to tailor the intensity of the stress response to the magnitude of the problem. It happens then that environmental enrichment, diversity, and physical exercise, which are more likely to happen in extensive systems than in intensive ones, have a benefit for hippocampus functioning because they promote neurogenesis when animals are adult. You know that many years ago we thought that the creation of new neurons was not possible when animals were adult. We know that that is not the case, that we produce neurons in some parts of the brain throughout our lives. One of these parts is the hippocampus, and basically living in a diverse environment, doing physical activity promotes this creation of new neurons in the hippocampus, and a healthy hippocampus allows the animals to match the intensity of the stress to the magnitude of the problem. So allows the animal to control effectively the stress response. And that is good from an animal welfare perspective. I was saying just a few minutes before that all this is closely linked to the concept of temperament, because the individuality of the animals plays a key role when it comes to understand its welfare state. Now, the term temperament describes individual differences in behavior which are consistent across time and situations, and temperament very often refers to traits such as fearfulness, aggression, exploration, which are relevant to animal welfare? Well, we know that temperament is extremely important to understand the welfare problems that animals may encounter in extensive environments, and also is important to understand the benefits that animals may obtain from living in a diverse environment. And a very good example of this is a work that Juan and I did at Utah State University, looking at how temperament of sheep may affect the ability of sheep to eat novel food. And what we found is that animals which are less fearful tend to be less neophobic, meaning that they are able to use a greater diversity of plants. And so there is a link between temperament and the benefits that an extensive system can provide for the welfare of the animals. And this leads me to my last slide, which is a summary of the main ideas, 5 ideas. So remember, animal welfare is important for not only for its own sake, but also for human health and welfare. But most research on farm animal welfare has addressed problems in intensive systems. However, extensive systems can also have important welfare problems. On the other hand, extensive systems provide animals with more opportunity to express their natural behavior, and equally important, they provide diversity and challenges. And we know now that diversity and cognitive challenges have short and long-term positive effects on welfare. And these benefits of welfare are dependent to some extent on the temperament of animals, which plays a key role in their ability to cope with their environment. That's all from me. Thank you very much again, Pablo. Thank you all for listening, and looking forward to the questions.